So last night, a couple friends of mine sent me an article that came out. It was on this site called NBC News Think. So it's part of NBC News by some writer named Jeff Slate. Okay, Jeff Slate is some singer-songwriter from New York City that writes for other magazines and newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and Esquire, Rolling Stone. But basically, he's just an unknown singer-songwriter from New York. So he's talking about Paul Simon and how Paul Simon is not going to be known 200 years from now. Let me read you some of the things that he says. This is incredibly offensive. He starts out by saying, the best day of Paul Simon's life may have just been December 7th. It was the day that they announced that Bob Dylan, Simon's longtime Columbia Records label mate, sold his catalog to Universal Music Publishing. Well, maybe the biggest date in Paul Simon's life might have been when he got married or when he had a child. That was probably the biggest date, not when Bob Dylan's catalog got sold. I mean, they obviously don't have editors for articles like this. Then he says, always a ruthless operator, Simon no doubt saw the sale of Dylan to the rival company as a golden opportunity. Okay, so I just made a video on this, on why these people like Bob Dylan, Stevie Nicks, Neil Young, Paul Simon are selling their publishing catalogs. This guy has no idea why they're doing this. All right, this is just clickbait. Then he goes on to say, and let's face it, Simon hasn't had any kind of a hit in more than a decade, and he's hardly part of a cultural firmament anymore. At his age, looking down the barrel of his dwindling ability to perform, not to mention the unrelenting march of time and history, has already begun to make his music a little more than a period curio. That's like a trinket. Okay, curio. It's probably a smart move to take the money and run. Okay, he's actually comparing Bob Dylan and the Beatles. He talks about how their music is going to be relevant in 200 years, okay, but not Paul Simon's, because this guy knows what's going to be relevant. Now, when's the last time Bob Dylan had a hit? I can't remember Bob Dylan having a hit recently. How about the Beatles? Let's see. They broke up in 1970. When's the last time they had a hit? What does that have to do with anything? So I thought to myself, okay, let's see something. If I go to Spotify, let's look at the average monthly listeners. Let's see, Bob Dylan has 9.7 million monthly listeners. Pretty good for a guy that's almost 80. Paul Simon only has 7.4 million, so 2 million less. Oh, wait a second. There's Simon and Garfunkel too. Oh, 9.4 million. So Paul Simon actually has way more followers on Spotify of his music than Bob Dylan does. Then he goes on to say, there's another darker reality assuredly at work, assuredly. While the Beatles and Dylan's places in history, not just musical history, but history, are no doubt etched in stone, even their contemporaries like Young are beginning to fade from relevance. He means Neil Young. It's hard to imagine in 200 years or more, when historians dig into culture of the late 20th century, anyone but the Beatles and Bob Dylan will be worth more than a passing mention. Really? Let's go back 200 years. It would be 1821. If I said to you, the most recorded composer in history is going to be Johann Sebastian Bach 200 years from now, be like, who? The only people that knew who Bach were people like Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and their teachers, because they all played the well-tempered clavier. But did anyone really know who Bach was? No. There was a composer named Felix Mendelssohn that premiered the St. Matthew Passion in 1829 that he got from his grandmother and his great aunt that turned him on to Bach. And that began the re-evaluation of Bach's music. 1829, 79 years after Bach died, okay? It wasn't until then did people even begin to find out, the general public, who Johann Sebastian Bach was. I actually made a pilgrimage to the St. Thomas Church back in 2018, where Bach was the Kapellmeister from 1723 until his death in 1750. But in 1821, 200 years ago, no one knew who he was. Now, in 1950, Bach's works were cataloged. 200 years after he died, they were first cataloged, his 1,100 some odd works, 1,186 works, I believe. You see BWV after any Bach piece. That means Bach Works Catalog. That's what that means in German. Okay, so this guy is trying to say who's going to be relevant 200 years from now. He has no idea whether Paul Simon or Bob Dylan or the Beatles are going to be relevant to historians. Try and say what music historians are going to be talking about, what's going to be relevant to them 200 years from now. You have no idea. The article goes on to say, that means Young and Joni Mitchell and Bruce Springsteen and of course Paul Simon, all giants in their day, will be no more than footnotes at best to Dylan and the Beatles, if only because history is a blunt instrument and doesn't have room, at least not in the broadest sense, for subtlety. Okay. Joni Mitchell? Joni Mitchell, I love Bob Dylan, but come on, Joni Mitchell musically is one of the most brilliant songwriters stylistically. There's no comparison between her and Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is a brilliant lyricist, but he's basically a folk singer. Okay, yeah, he has the most covered songs of all time. When music historians look at Joni Mitchell's catalog, they're going to see records like Mingus. They're going to see Hijira. They're going to see that she played with all the greatest jazz musicians like Jaco Pastorius, Pat Metheny, Michael Brecker, Larry Carlton. The greatest musicians of the 20th century played in her bands. Herbie Hancock. She was revered by the greatest jazz musicians, in addition to all the greatest songwriters like Bob Dylan, like Gordon Lightfoot, like David Crosby. So this nobody songwriter from New York City, this guy that doesn't have an editor, is trying to say people like Joni Mitchell and Bruce Springsteen and Neil Young and of course Paul Simon are going to be irrelevant 200 years from now. Let me remind you of some of Paul Simon's songs. The Sound of Silence, The Boxer, Mrs. Robinson, Scarborough Fair, I'm a Rock, America, Homeward Bound, Cecilia, 59th Street Bridge Song, Feeling Groovy. Or some of his solo hits, Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard, You Can Call Me Al, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, Mother and Child Reunion, Kodachrome, Slip Sliding Away, Still Crazy After All These Years. Bridge Over Troubled Water. What do you say about that song? It's got one of the most sophisticated harmonic progressions, melodies. The bridge is ridiculous. It's got one of the best vocal performances by Art Garfunkel. If you try to compare just that song to Bob Dylan's songs, this is not a slight against Dylan, right? Like a Rolling Stone, Knocking on Heaven's Door, Hurricane, Blowing in the Wind, Times They Are Changing. These are like 4 or 5 chord songs. Okay? Yeah. Bob Dylan is a genius songwriter. Like I said, I named my son Dylan and I named my daughter Lennon. Okay, that's how I feel about the Beatles and Bob Dylan. But you don't know what people are going to think of these songs in the future. They may talk about the greatest song of the 20th century being that song, Bridge Over Troubled Water, or The Boxer, or The Sound of Silence. Or they may just be grouped as singer-songwriters of the 20th century. But people revere Joni Mitchell. We don't know what's going to happen. Just like in 1821, everybody's like, Johann Sebastian, who? Who's that? There are people that are alive now that will be talked about from the 20th century that you have never heard of. I guarantee you, there are people alive. There's people that I know even, that I believe 200 years from now, people will be talking about, whose music is unknown right now. So this joker that wrote this thing for NBC News, don't they have editors that read these things? This guy is writing this crap? John Mayer put this post up on Instagram last night. But there are only a few names our descendants will ever learn. Well, I'm one of Paul Simon's descendants, and for as long as I live, I will make sure he is never forgotten. Well, I'm with John Mayer on this. This is just offensive as far as I'm concerned. And this guy, I don't know who the people are at NBC News that let this pass, but they need to hire an editor to check these guys. Maybe hire a musicologist to say, hey, can we really say this? Because anybody with any common sense would say, you can't write an article like this. He goes on to say, so Paul Simon, who is essentially an also-ran 60s icon on a centennial or millennial scale, is making a rational calculation. He's cashing out while he can in the hope that the broader commercialization of his greatest works might just secure him a better place in history. if even temporarily, no matter how sad an indictment of our times that may be? Who is this nobody singer-songwriter guy, Jeff Slate, to talk about his historical relevance, or Bob Dylan's historical relevance, or the Beatles, or Joni Mitchell, or Bruce Springsteen, or Neil Young? Hire somebody that actually knows something about music, okay? That actually knows something about history and history of music, if you want to talk about what's going to be relevant 200 years from now. Unbelievable. Thanks for watching. That's all for now. Don't forget to subscribe. If you're a first-time viewer, ring the bell. That'll let you know when I go live and when a new video comes out. Give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment. That's very important. If you're interested in the Beato book, go to my website at www.rickbeato.com. Follow me on Instagram at rickbeato1. Check out the new Beato ear training program at beatoeartraining.com. And if you want to support the channel even more, think about becoming a member of the Beato Club. Thanks for watching.